Today we will define food security and talk about how we measure food security, learn about who is food insecure and where they are located, and look at progress to date on addressing the issue. So in 1996, there was a World Food Summit in Rome at the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, or FAO. They then defined in that summit what is food security. So food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for a healthy and active life. Now you could argue, is anyone food secure? Yes, people are food secure, but the question is how are we going to feed 9 billion people well, and in that sense, in the food security definition? So when we look at food security, there are really 4 pillars: food availability, food access, food utilization, and food stability. And let's break those down. So availability is meant by the physical access of food, either from one's own production or what's available in the market. Access is, can the household or the individual afford the food? Is it geographically close to them? Do they have the sufficient resources to be able to access that food on a regular basis? Utilization is a more complicated pillar and one that's often ignored, but it's the socioeconomic and the biological aspects of food security. Is an individual and a household healthy to be able to absorb the nutrients from the food that was available and accessible? You have to be in a healthy state to be able to do that. So that's one key piece of utilization. The other is, how does the household make decisions about what food is consumed and how it's allocated across the household? Last is stability, which refers to the temporal dimension of food security and often involves food prices and volatility. So how do we measure food security? Well, there's lots of ways, but mainly globally, people have rallied around 1 or 2 indicators. Most people follow the FAO definition of food security, also called the undernourishment indicator, that really tries to capture availability, access, utilization, and stability. So this is the prevalence of undernutrition indicator, or POU. Again, it's collected by FAO on an annual basis. It was the target for the Millennium Development Goal 1, in which largely a lot of countries achieved. And really what it measures is the proportion of the population below the minimum level of dietary energy consumption, referred to as the prevalence of undernutrition. It's a percentage of the population that is undernourished or food deprived. Another interesting measure is the Global Hunger Index. This is a composite indicator of 3 different separate indicators that all come together to really give a nice picture of hunger. One is child mortality, so consequences of being hungry in a severe form. The undernourishment indicator that I just spoke about, the FAO indicator, and underweight for age in children under 5 years of age. This comes together as one composite indicator, and I'll show some of those results in a moment. So who is food insecure? This graph is showing you GDP growth on the bottom axis, and then the undernutrition or undernourishment indicator, the FAO indicator. And we see that with economic growth, undernutrition declines, or hunger declines. And that's sort of a classic figure that you see across a lot of health and nutrition indicators. So how are we doing? Why do we still have so many food insecure people in the world? Well, we've actually seen a decline. When we started tracking food insecurity in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw a lot of people who were undernourished. Over 1 billion people were undernourished. We now have hit the mark below 800 million, as you can see from this graph. So we're making progress, but still there's a huge amount of people who are undernourished. Where do we see this food insecurity? Well, this set of graphs is showing you regional differences. The orange line indicates the number of people who are undernourished. The gray line is the percentage or prevalence of undernourished. So while the gray line shows that overall people are declining, the prevalence is declining, we're actually seeing some interesting changes in the numbers. If you look at Africa, sadly, there's more people who are undernourished. The numbers are increasing. Whereas you see in places like Asia, there's declines in undernutrition. China's made big progress, so you see that number mixed in with a lot of other Asian countries can create a complicated, not as well represented figure, but still, Asia has made big progress. We also see big declines in Latin America and the Caribbean in undernutrition and undernourishment. Let's look at the Global Hunger Index, the composite index that is made up of 3 indicators. We can see that overall, there's been declines. If you look at the developing world, we're seeing declines since the 1990s. And there's a mixed bag when you start looking regionally. We can see in Africa and South Asia, they have a higher global hunger index, but also there's been declines, but not as rapidly. One thing to keep in mind is that food security is multifaceted. It requires more than just growing, moving, and consuming food. Food security requires a functional food system that has a lot of different moving parts. Food has to move through a value chain. There's a lot of actors engaged in that value chain that involves producers, processors, and many other actors. One thing that's also important is the food environment. This is the interface of how and where the consumer engages with the food system. Another thing to keep in mind is that food systems are very contextualized depending on where you live. They're very local. There's micro food systems, there's macro food systems. We can think about our global food system being very connected because we live in a very globalized world. But different food systems can reap different outcomes, and consumers engage in very different food systems depending on where you live. Another thing to keep in mind is that food systems are under a lot of pressure. There's many forces or external factors that are changing food systems and will continue to put pressure on food systems and ensuring they deliver healthy food for everyone. Some of these pressures are things like population growth, population pressure in certain places, urbanization, climate change, natural resource degradation, conflict, social unrest due to food price increases or food failures, food safety issues like antimicrobial resistance, changes in diets, demand for animal source foods, energy-intensive diets, ecosystem and biodiversity loss, which is going to change food supplies and their diversity, food waste, food loss, the grain drain, shifts in land use like biofuel use, land grabbing, countries buying land in different countries to ensure that they have their own food security, and food price instability and economic crises. We've seen already the pressures on the food system, and we're going to continue to see that unless we do something about it. So I'm going to walk you through this framework. This looks complicated, but it really is a good description of the food system. If you look at the value chain actors, food moves through a chain, and we try to add value as it moves through the chain. So food is produced, it's stored, it's distributed to different places, it's processed and packaged, and then it hits retail and markets. Once it hits those markets, whether they're informal or formal, supermarkets, bodegas, corner stores, consumers then have the ability to interact with that food system. That is what we call the food environment. That food environment is a complex environment. It changes maybe on a daily basis for the consumer, depending on where they go, school, work, train station, an informal wet market in sub-Saharan Africa. And what influences choice is that food environment. It could be packaging, placement of food, the branding of food, the cost, the preferences of that consumer. That then influences the quality of the diet, the safety of the diet, and the diversity of the diet. The diet then influences nutrition outcomes, which has societal consequences, environmental consequences, equity consequences. So that pathway that I'm explaining and that's shown in the framework really walks you through from production all the way to health outcomes. Now take a look at the top of the framework. These are different drivers that are influencing the food system, and we'll get into this in a little bit. There's biophysical environmental drivers, climate change being a big one, natural resources or natural capital, land, water, soil. These are all really important for food production and can be constrained or can be in abundance. We have issues of political will, policy, sociocultural factors, religion, tradition, the importance of food in a society or in a household. We have issues of demography, changing age, different populations. We have an older global population that's going to change the food environment and the kind of demand for different foods. So there's all these different drivers that are triggering the food system, and they'll influence not only the value chain, but the food environment and consumer behavior patterns.